everyone, and welcome to this video explaining the new VAT domestic reverse charge for building and construction services. My name is Natalie Pieri and I'm a chartered certified accountant. I've been in the accounting industry for just over 16 years and I'm the owner of a firm of accountants based in Rochester, Kent called Accounting Connections Limited. Just before we jump into today's content, I'd really like it if you could take a few moments just to click on that subscribe button. What that's going to do is that's going to help boost up our profile so that we can get more informational videos like this out into the world to help other people. Okay, so let's jump into the content. The VAT domestic reverse charge, who exactly is it going to affect? It's only going to affect you if you're VAT registered, CIS registered, and if you actually provide building and construction services. If these things don't apply to you, then neither does the domestic reverse charge. Okay, so in order to establish what's changed and why, I think it's important to recap over how VAT works. So here we have an example of a standard invoice that you might see a subcontractor sending to a contractor. They've charged £1,000 for their labour time, they've charged another £200 in materials. What they've then done is they've added VAT on top of that at 20% like they should, and they then took off 20% CIS, which is only on the labour element. The CIS is taken from the contractor and passed over to HMRC, so that part of the process is absolutely fine. The VAT element, however, that needs accounting on both sides. At the moment, the subcontractor needs to take that £240, pay it over to HMRC on their next VAT return, and on the flip side, the contractor needs to take that £240 and reclaim it from HMRC on their next VAT return. So let's think about the movement of money here. The subcontractors are paying their money into HMRC. HMRC are then paying that money out to the contractors. It's a nice, clear, smooth movement of money, and it should be simple. But there is a problem. The contractors are doing their part fine. They're reclaiming the VAT from HMRC, and HMRC are correctly paying it out. However, the subcontractors are letting the side down. They're not paying into HMRC, which means that HMRC, if they're not getting the money in but they're having to pay the money out, it's leaving them at a deficit. So they had to find a solution to this problem, and the solution they came up with was the VAT domestic reverse charge for the building and construction services. This came into effect on the 1st of March 2021. Now, what is the purpose of this new rule? Essentially, the purpose is that HMRC are looking to shift the responsibility for paying that VAT over to them higher up the chain. It means that instead of having to reclaim VAT from 3 or 4 different sources, they're reclaiming it from one. It means that when it comes to trying to identify people who aren't complying with the rules, they are only having now to go to a smaller pool of much bigger players as opposed to having to chase a multitude of much smaller contractors. So in order to establish whether you fall under the rules or not, there are 3 steps that you need to go through in every project. Firstly, you need to identify who the end user is. Who is the last person receiving the building and construction services? Who is then not passing them any further up the chain? Who is the chain of supply? How many of you are there in this chain, and where do you fall specifically within it? Thirdly, you need to work through the HMRC flowchart. This is available to view on the gov.uk website. It's 5 questions, very simple, and it tells you in each scenario if the answer is yes or no, what it is you need to do, if the rules apply to you or not. So establishing a chain of supply. This is what a standard chain of supply looks like. You've got a subcontractor providing services to a subcontractor who sells those services onward to a contractor who sells the services to an end user. The end user tends to be the person who owns the land on which the development is occurring. Okay, so that person doesn't necessarily have to be VAT registered or CIS registered. It just has to be the last person in the chain, the person who's requested the work be done and the person who owns the land. So, that's steps 1 and 2. Step 3, the HMRC flowchart. Like I say, this is available to view for everybody on gov.uk. However, I'm going to talk you through each of the questions one by one. So question 1, does the supply fall within the scope of CIS? If it doesn't, then normal VAT rules apply. Add VAT onto your invoice like you would normally. If, however, your work does fall within the scope of VAT, then you move on to the next question. Is the supply standard or reduced rated? Sounds like an irrelevant question, but it's not, because people in the construction industry can provide services at zero rate. Those people tend to be people who are working on new build properties. The majority of the work that's done on new build properties is VATable at 0%. So if you are not providing services at standard or reduced rate, then normal VAT rates apply. If you are, then move on to the next question. Question 3, is your customer VAT registered? If they aren't VAT registered, then you apply VAT as normal, like you normally would. If they are VAT registered, you move on to question 4. Question 4, is your customer registered for CIS? If they're not registered for CIS, apply VAT in the normal way. If they are, then you need to move on to question 5. The 5th and final question, has your customer provided written confirmation that it is an end user? If they have, and they've said, yes, I am the end user, then apply VAT as normal. You add VAT onto your invoice. If, however, they haven't provided you with written confirmation that they're the end user, then this is where the domestic reverse charge kicks in. So there is, in fact, a lot of criteria that you need to go through before this domestic reverse charge even applies. So, okay, I've bombarded you with a lot of technical guidance there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put it into an example that you might be a bit more familiar with, that could be a bit more relatable to your situation. So this is the example we've got. A domestic customer called Mrs. Robinson. She contacts a building and construction company, and they're called ABC Builders Limited. She would like a large extension built on her home. Now, ABC Builders Limited, they are a VAT and CIS registered business. They quote Mrs. Robinson for the work, and she accepts that quote. So ABC Builders start building the walls, and then they say, do you know what, we need to subcontract out this plastering work, and I know a great company called XYZ Plastering Limited. They're VAT and CIS registered, let's get them in. Now, XYZ Plastering Limited, they don't really have enough manpower to produce this work on such short notice, so what they're doing is that they're going to subcontract it out to Mr. Jones. He's also VAT registered. He's a sole trader. Let's work through the 3 steps relating to this scenario. Number 1, who is the end user? Who's the person that owns the land on which the development is taking place? And in this scenario, the end user is Mrs. Robinson. So let's put Mrs. Robinson where she belongs in the chain of supply. She is the end user. You can now work backwards from the end user to identify where you sit in the chain. So ABC Builders Limited would be the contractor. They're the ones supplying the services to Mrs. Robinson. XYZ Plastering Limited would be the subcontractor. And Mr. Jones is the subcontractor. So that's your chain of supply. Now you have to work through the HMRC flowchart. And for this, it has to be all of the business relationships up the chain. Mr. Jones will be invoicing XYZ Plastering Limited, and XYZ Plastering Limited will be invoicing ABC Builders Limited. Now, for this example, all of the answers to the HMRC flowchart are going to be the same for both of these relationships, so I'm just going to run through those now. Does the supply fall within the scope of CIS? Yes, it does. It's plastering work. Is the supply standard or reduced rated? Yes, it's standard rated. Is your customer VAT registered? So for Mr. Jones, he's looking at XYZ Plastering Limited, and he says, yes, they are VAT registered. XYZ Plastering Limited are looking at ABC Builders Limited, and they're saying, yes, they're VAT registered, so that's all fine. Is your customer registered for CIS? Well, yes, both XYZ Plastering Limited and ABC Builders Limited are registered for CIS. Is your customer the end user? Well, we've already established that Mrs. Robinson is the end user, so neither XYZ Plastering Limited nor ABC Builders Limited are the end user. What that means is that the domestic reverse charge applies for both of the relationships between Mr. Jones, XYZ Plastering Limited and ABC Builders. Now we have to look at the relationship between ABC Builders Limited and Mrs. Robinson. Does the supply fall within the scope of CIS? Yes, it's construction work. Is the supply standard or reduced rated? Yes, it's standard rated. Is your customer VAT registered? No, Mrs. Robinson is a domestic customer, she's not VAT registered. So normal VAT rules apply. This is where you would need to stop in the flowchart. There's no need to continue going on, but for completeness I'm going to carry on. Is your customer registered for CIS? No, she's not, in which case normal VAT rules would apply. Is your customer the end user? Yes, she is. Again, normal VAT rules apply. So let's look at the VAT chain. When Mr. Jones invoices XYZ Plastering Limited, domestic reverse charge applies. When XYZ Plastering Limited is invoicing ABC Builders Limited, domestic reverse charge applies. When ABC Builders Limited invoice Mrs. Robinson, normal VAT rules apply. So let's take a look at the actual application of the domestic reverse charge. How does it look on your invoice? So here we have the invoice example that I gave earlier, and what we're going to do now is we're going to say that this applies to domestic reverse charge. So that is what the new invoice looks like. You will see here that the VAT is actually reversed on the face of the invoice. So you still charge VAT and you still show how much VAT is chargeable on the invoice, but you reverse it out so that nothing is payable. You'll also then notice that instead of £1,240 being payable by the customer, only £1,000 is now payable. This also means that your VAT returns are going to look a bit different. This is your VAT return before the reverse charge is applied. You've got your £240 on your sale, and if you have spent £200 on your materials, then you will have £40 to reclaim. So overall, you're having to pay over £200 to HMRC. After the reverse charge, there's not going to be any outputs. You haven't collected any VAT because your contractor is not going to have to pay you that. So now, your liability has turned into a reclaim. So you're now going to have to get a refund of that from HMRC. Now it's time to really think about how this is going to affect you going forward. There's going to be a cash flow impact here. There is going to be this impact of being a reclaim. If you're going to be a reclaim customer for HMRC, then why wait to put in your returns quarterly? You might want to rethink that and change to monthly returns so that you can get that money in a bit quicker. You may also want to consider stop using the flat rate scheme. Now, this is because under the flat rate scheme, you aren't able to reclaim VAT on your business costs, whereas you can under traditional VAT accounting. So I've put together a quick visual here to show how these new rules are likely to impact your cash flow. So you can see here that Mr. Jones would be receiving in £1,200, XYZ Plasterers would be receiving £6,000, and ABC Builders would be receiving £12,000 before domestic reverse charge. Once domestic reverse charge rules are applied, Mr. Jones is now only going to receive £1,000. XYZ Plastering Limited is now only going to receive £5,000, and ABC Builders, they're still going to receive £12,000 because there's been absolutely no change to the VAT application in that relationship between ABC Builders and Mrs. Robinson, the end user. So this is how the VAT returns work. So the VAT returns are going to look different for each person up the chain. So I'm going to start with the subcontractor, Mr. Jones, and work my way up the list. So before the domestic reverse charge is applied, he would have charged £200 VAT on his invoice. He would have received that in and paid that over to HMRC. His liability would have been £200. After the reverse charge, there's no VAT collected, no VAT paid. The VAT liability is nothing. There is nothing to pay over. But he still made £1,000 sales, so that still has to go in box 6. The next person up the chain is XYZ Plastering Limited. Now remember, he has bought in services from Mr. Jones for £1,000 plus VAT. He has then charged his services on to ABC Builders Limited at £5,000 plus VAT. So the VAT element is £1,000. Under standard VAT rules, he would pay over £1,000, reclaim £200, so all he has to physically pay over to HMRC is the £800. However, after domestic reverse charge has been applied, no VAT is exchanging hands. He hasn't passed any VAT on to Mr. Jones, nor has he received any VAT from ABC Builders Limited. So there is no liability to pay. You will, however, notice that £200, which is the VAT from the transaction with Mr. Jones, is now showing in two places. It's showing as an output and as an input. That is showing that the VAT has been moved up the chain. This is showing that the domestic reverse charge has been applied. Next person up the chain is ABC Builders Limited. They've purchased services from XYZ Plasterers Limited for £5,000 plus VAT, and they have forwarded it on. The cost of the project has been forwarded to Mrs. Robinson at £10,000 plus VAT. The VAT element of that being £2,000. So here we see the VAT return under standard VAT rules. They would say that they've got to pay over £2,000, reclaim £1,000, which is the VAT on the XYZ Plasterers Limited invoice. So the VAT liability they only physically have to pay out is £1,000. After the domestic reverse charge has been applied, however, they have to add on the £1,000 to their inputs, take off £1,000, add on another £1,000 to their outputs, so their liability is actually increased to £2,000. And again, like I say, this is where we show the VAT on the transaction with XYZ Plastering Limited. So the main contractor's liability increases. That is the point to note here. The VAT has been pushed up and up the chain, and now the ABC Builders are responsible for passing that over to HMRC. So under normal VAT rules, this is how the VAT would have been passed on. The VAT for the overall project was what ABC Builders Limited was supplying to Mrs. Robinson. It was £2,000 worth of VAT. That VAT, in the traditional accounting, would have been received by HMRC in 3 instalments. They would have received £200 from Mr. Jones, £800 from XYZ Plastering Limited, and £1,000 from ABC Builders Limited. Under the new domestic reverse charge, Mr. Jones doesn't pay anything, XYZ Plastering doesn't pay anything, ABC Builders pays the whole £2,000. So as far as HMRC are concerned, they're still getting the same money in, and it's only coming from one source. Do you see now how this makes it much easier for HMRC to identify those people who have and haven't paid them, and how to deal with non-compliance, because there are far less people now that they have to deal with. Like every good HMRC legislation, there are always exceptions to the rule. Exceptions here are if you provide services that are outside the scope of CIS, the rules don't apply to you, and if you're a labour agency, these new rules don't apply to you. Let's go into a tiny bit more detail on these two before we finish up. Services outside of the scope of CIS, so there are some specific examples here. More are available on the website, but specifically architects, surveyors, sign writers, installation of security systems, carpet fitters and scaffold hire. Those people, although their work is provided on a construction site, it does not fall within the terms of the CIS scheme, and therefore VAT is charged as normal on all their services, domestic reverse charge does not apply. Now, the final point I want to make is there is a clear distinction between a labour agency and a subcontractor who only charges for labour services. A labour agency, domestic reverse charge would not apply to these people. They will always charge you VAT as normal on their services because they're not providing you with building and construction services. They are providing you with the supply of labour. A subcontractor, however, who only charges you for their labour, they do apply under the domestic reverse charge rules because although they're only charging you for their time, for their labour, they are in fact charging you for building and construction services. If we think back to the example, Mr. Jones is providing his services to XYZ Plastering Limited. He's providing plastering services and he is billed for his time. Okay, so that's us wrapping up now. So yeah, I would really like it if you could, again, if you haven't done so already, click on that subscribe button so that we can help get the message out there, help clarify these situations for people like yourselves. And if you want to follow us on our socials, then that is how you do so. We're very active on our socials. We like to give as much information out as we can on a regular basis. For now, thank you very much for listening.